Welcome to the Catholic Midlife podcast, where we address the challenges and the opportunities of midlife from a uniquely Catholic perspective. This is the time, my friends, for a deeper renewal of your Christian vocation. Come and enter into the freedom of Christ that allows you to be the person you were created to be, because there's an amazing, awesome, exciting next season of life waiting for you. Hello, and welcome to the Catholic Midlife podcast. I'm Karen, and I'm here with my co-host, Curtis.
Hi, everybody.
And we're excited to be here with you on this podcast, Thought Traps Part 2.
Oh, yeah, this is fun. This always cracks us up when we hear some of the thought traps we repeatedly fall into our own bad selves.
We sure do.
And speaking of falling into whatever it is, we do have a listener that's fallen into the habit of listening to the podcast. And he says, "You are knocking it out of the park," as we would say in Boston. Great work, Karen Herbert, and to your dear husband.
Wow, that's very kind and encouraging message.
And as we might say in Minnesota, oh, you got to get your boots on pretty early if you want to keep up with us.
Good job for being an implant into Minnesota. You've taken on some of the
characteristics.
Oh,
the assimilation, it just happens.
It does. It does. And believe it or not, friends, there are more thought traps for us to share with you in this episode. You thought we'd cover them all, but we didn't.
They are endless. How about this one, Karen? Personalizing. You attribute a disproportionate amount of the blame to yourself for negative events, and you fail to see that certain events are also caused by others.
Wow, this is classic. You know, something happens and it's all because I failed, or I didn't do something, or I did do something wrong.
We rush to take responsibility, and in our hurry, we take responsibility for our part, for their part, for things that just happened. We just swallow up the whole thing.
Sure. Like my marriage ended because I failed. It was my fault.
Ooh, yeah, it was my fault, my failure. Or this speaks close to home. I haven't called that person for months, so it's my fault. That relationship is treading water.
Sure. But did they call you?
Yeah,
maybe not.
Exactly. We could share some of that water treading.
Exactly. And I think we see this a lot when our young adults are making choices that are hard for us. Like, for example, my child left the church and it's all my fault. There's something I didn't do. I should have fill in the blank.
Well, that was my example. Oh. And the example was my child left the Catholic Church to become a Cuban revolutionary and to collect Che Guevara memorabilia. It's my fault. I should have fill in the blank. Or my friend Mark, who I admire a lot for all the things he does with his kids. I think, well, I should have done what Mark does, right. You know, that thing, blah, blah, blah.
Right. And then in a certain way, I'm fortune telling too, because I've decided that if I had done such and such, then such and such would have happened.
Right. There's no sense in limiting ourselves to just one trap at a time.
Exactly. And often these do overlap and interact. So really, we want to see clearly what is our part and what responsibility belongs to others or other influences.
And realize that we're not perfect in the midst of it.
Yeah.
But that cuts to self-compassion. And we've had episodes on that and probably more in the future.
Yes.
As we go through all these thought traps, I want to encourage listeners to just sort of pick their favorite one out of the group. And think about that one and how you fall into it and to be on the lookout for it.
Sure. And when it shows up. Here's another thought trap. It's kind of the opposite of personalizing, but blaming, where now you focus on someone else as the source of your negative feelings or negative experience. And you don't take responsibility for changing yourself or your environment.
Boy, this has got to be one of my favorites. I surely do like to blame somebody else. It's my first instinct. I don't think I'm the only one.
No.
And, she's to blame for the way I feel now.
Yeah. Oh, it's all because of my parents. They caused all of my problems. And here's a distinction here, right? Often we aren't responsible for things that happen to us or ways that we were formed. And yet at the same time, we are responsible for making the changes, for choosing something differently, regardless of how or why things ended up where they are.
Yeah, it's one thing to name the chaos that surrounded you in your upbringing. And all of us have some disorder in our past. That's human nature. So it's one thing to name it, but it's something else to blame your mistakes on those things that are in your past.
Yeah. So here's a trap: unfair comparisons. Unfair comparisons. You tend to interpret events with unrealistic standards. So maybe you always focus on other people who you think or judge are doing better than you, and you always feel inferior when you're comparing.
She's more successful than I am. That's an example.
Sure. Or so-and-so does better than me on tests, or so-and-so always does better than me.
Right. So one of my friends from graduate school,
Yeah.
he's a triple-digit millionaire now.
Wow.
Not sure how I feel about that.
Yeah. Yeah, but interesting. You probably pick him out to compare yourself against versus how many other people are, quote unquote, doing not as well as you in whatever way that you're creating a standard around that.
Yeah. Well, he's super talented. He really deserves it, I guess, in a lot of ways, we could say. And you're right. My radar looks around for the brightest beacon to compare myself to.
Exactly.
And of course, money is not everything, my friends, as we know so well. Mm-hmm. But actually, he's got all the virtues as well. But anyway.
So you picked really the worst person to compare yourself with.
Yeah, don't compare yourself to St. Paul or N.T. Wright. That's what we say. Ooh, here's another one. Are you ready?
Bring it on.
Are you ready?
Well, no, but go ahead.
Well, I think as a mom,
you're
doomed, frankly. Well, you're not doomed, honey. But here's a thought trap. Regret orientation.
Yeah.
You focus on the idea that you could have done better in the past rather than on what you can do better now.
Sure. If only I had tried harder, I could have done better at XYZ.
I could have tried harder.
Yeah.
We could always say that, right?
Yeah.
Or I could have done better if I had tried harder.
Yeah, this really keeps us stuck in the past. And I think it creates feelings of powerlessness because we're at the mercy of this thing that we think we should have done better at. And guess what? You don't get a do-over. All do-overs have to happen now. And so instead of being stuck in the past, there's lots of opportunity to invest in changes that we can make right now that will have an effect in our own lives.
And that's really the thing about the regret orientation is it's disempowering.
Yeah.
It sucks us down and it's holding us back, ironically, and it reinforces whatever it is we are regretting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Another thought trap is we get stuck in this what if question. We just keep asking questions about, well, what if something happens? And then I'm just maybe not satisfied with any of the answers. Well, yeah, but what if I get anxious? Or what if I can't breathe properly? Or what if I say something that I regret?
Yeah, this is always a sign of something else when I'm contemplating some course of action and I just keep saying, well, what if this? What if that? What if ABC? And there's a certain amount of contingency planning we do, of course, but if we're just keep churning out the what ifs, then, oh yeah, there's something else going on here. Here's one. Emotional reasoning. This is when you let your feelings guide your interpretation of reality. So we all know we can get angry sometimes, And all of a sudden that's guiding how we interpret events. So something makes us angry and we think, well, that person over there, they're really a bad person because they whipped into the parking place that I was contemplating. Now, boy, they are bad.
Right. Or I'm feeling kind of isolated and disconnected or maybe a little depressed. So therefore, I don't have any friends. I don't have any good friends. Or maybe therefore, my marriage just isn't working right now.
Right. And so you seize on this kind of conclusion or explanation, but it's not supported by what's actually going on. It's that negative emotion usually is limiting our perspective. We're not looking around at what's really going on. And so this trap, you're jumping to a conclusion. So I'm depressed. That means my marriage isn't working well.
Emotions, they're really important information. I know we've said that in the past. You want to pay attention to your emotions because they're telling you something. But like you said, Curtis, we don't want to jump a lot of logical steps to get to some interpretation or conclusion of reality that isn't holistic.
Yeah, I'm always leery of this. We have a great deal of respect for the emotions, for the information they bring, for having them, for honoring them, experiencing them, and avoiding the mistake of just, down-regulating your entire emotional life. We're always trying to regulate our emotions, but still have them.
Yes.
And I think it's because so often we do recognize this trap of emotional reasoning where, all of a sudden our emotions are in control and they're just driving our behavior. And the rationality can go out of the window, but we don't want to throw the emotions out of the window either.
Good point. Good point. So here's a thought trap you might recognize: inability to disconfirm. So this is when you have kind of a negative thought pattern or you're stuck in rumination, and any evidence or arguments that might contradict what you think, you just reject out of hand. So if you're thinking, I don't have any good friends, you might reject as irrelevant any evidence that people are engaging with you, that people like you and are invested in you. You're not allowing your thought to be refuted.
Yeah, you're convinced things are a certain way and nothing can convince you otherwise. This thought trap makes me think of the angsty teenager.
Yes.
Or a preteen, perhaps.
Totally.
They're at a certain phase and they're going into some situation that's really uncomfortable, maybe auditioning for the school play or musical, and they could do some good. They might not get it, but they might get it. It would be a good experience. And they used to be interested in it, but all of a sudden they got some negative feedback. And now, no matter what you say, you can't remind them of, how much they really wanted to try this. And they keep coming up with counter examples when you tell them of, some success they've had in this area in the past.
Yeah. That's not what's going on, Mom. You just don't understand.
Yeah, that's right.
You just don't understand.
So,
so nothing you say counts.
Yeah. You need to level up, Mom.
So here's our last thought trap for the day: having a judgment focus. A judgment focus. And we all make judgments all the time, right? We all have judgments, but this is really when you do a lot of evaluating and you're looking at yourself or others or events in an evaluation kind of way. It's good or bad. There's superior or inferior, rather than describing, understanding, accepting, choosing.
This is a huge topic. And what does it mean to be judgmental? How judgment can limit us? So anyway, examples are, well, I didn't perform well in college. So you're looking back at your college year and you just lump the whole thing into some big judgment of yourself.
Sure. Or I'm not successful. They're successful. You're creating this arbitrary standard. You're probably not even defining it. And then you're judging yourself as inadequate or falling short.
And this shows up in so many ways. I don't think we're going to really get into a lot of detail about the ins and outs of this. But I want to make one note, though, is that sometimes we can just judge everything through our moral lens. And moral discernment is so important. However, not everything comes down to, being good or bad. And there's a competitiveness in our society that I think it's kind of a corporate value where, success and advancement, those are good. But if you make a mistake, then you're bad. You're a bad person. Or maybe you're in a job where you're not doing that great. It's not suiting you. Then all of a sudden you're bad because you're not providing as much value as the person sitting in the cubicle next to you. And we have this moral lens that we bring to everything. And that could be one of the things about judgment. And I just bring it up because this kind of competitive value really reaches through a lot of our day-to-day experience.
Great. Thanks for sharing that, Curtis. I think I'd like to just tell our listeners a little story about a little bigger example of a person's situation and just pull out some of the thought traps, because we can have a lot of them showing up in one situation even. So I really like this story. It comes directly from a book by Dr. David Burns, and the book is called Feeling Great. And he digs into these thought traps and some ways to try to combat them and manage them in your life. And he tells his story about this lovely woman. I think he calls her Marilyn. It's not her real name. And Marilyn had something that triggered negative experience for her. So Marilyn received a call from one of her friends from church, and her friend had seen that Marilyn's mother-in-law had passed away, and she was calling to express her condolences. And this was really triggering for Marilyn because she was obviously sad that this woman had died, and she had a good relationship with her. But the call upset her because she had to tell this friend that, well, actually, it wasn't my mother-in-law who died. It was my ex-mother-in-law.
So Marilyn had to clear that up, I suppose.
She did. And in fact, part of why it was triggering was that Marilyn actually had 2 ex-mothers-in-law, and she was currently in her 3rd marriage. And this carried a great deal of shame for her. And she had a lot of fear that this friend was going to tell other people who would then judge her for her failed marriages. And she really had hidden these other marriages from people because she had this shame and this list of negative thoughts and emotions that showed up for her around this issue, even though she was currently in a very happy and successful marriage. So Marilyn was asked, well, what emotions come up for you because of this experience? And she said, well, I'm sad, I'm anxious, I'm afraid, I feel guilty and ashamed, embarrassed, frustrated, defective, hopeless. And she had all these negative thoughts that went with it. And one of the negative thoughts was, this woman will tell other people who will judge me. And Marilyn was very worried that her experiences would be public knowledge. Especially, she felt kind of embarrassed because she was very active in the marriage ministry of her church. So Marilyn was asked to pull out some of the thought traps that were lying under this idea that this friend is going to tell other people and they will judge me. So maybe Curtis will just pull out some so people can start to see what's going on when we have situations like this.
Sure. So in this example, Marilyn she was able to identify mind reading as one of the thought traps.
Yeah.
She's reading other people's minds. She's assuming a lot of things about what other people are going to think about her, but she doesn't really know what it is.
She doesn't really know.
They could or would think. Yeah.
Right. And she's fortune telling because part of what she's assuming is both this woman is going to tell other people and those other people will judge me.
Boy, I really have a lot of sympathy for these thought traps.
I do.
You know, she has all this kind of shame and I guess regrets or whatever about her marriage history. Mm-hmm. And she's just thinking all those dreadful things people are going to say. And that's too bad because she's obviously worked hard to, create a life and a faithful life beyond all of that.
Yes. And part of that is, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but one of the thought traps is she's discounting all the positives and filtering for the negative. So she's focused only on her failed marriages. And it's like, it doesn't matter or it doesn't count that she's currently in a wonderful marriage, that she's a kind, warm, generous, lovely person, that she's won lots of awards for her volunteer work and her investment in her church and in her community. And it's like none of that counts. It just counts that she has the failed marriages.
Right. So she's catastrophizing.
Yep.
She's thinking about, well, if other people know all this stuff about me, it's going to be the worst. It's going to be so horrible and awful. Boy, I could never endure it.
Right. I couldn't get through that reality. Mm-hmm. And labeling. She is judging herself incredibly. Like she's putting herself on trial and she's judging herself guilty. And I'm sure she has a lot of labels for herself around having the failed marriages.
And well, there's the traps go on. So there's overgeneralization. And so say if one person judges her, then, well, that's like everybody judging her. And so some people, they could find out more about her history and situation, and it might create more solidarity, more compassion with them.
Yes. Yeah. And in truth, some people probably may judge her for what she's experienced, and many people won't. And many people may love her and respect her more because of what she's been through.
Another thought trap, all or nothing thinking. So again, there's this feeling that everybody's going to judge her negatively. It's all going to be negative.
Yes. Yeah. And there's this negative emotion taking over, that emotional reasoning. If I feel guilty and ashamed, therefore I must be a failure. I must be a bad person. If I feel anxious and afraid, that means people will reject and judge me.
Boy, that's a really good example of emotional reasoning.
Yeah.
I feel guilty and ashamed, therefore I am.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And guess what? There's two people in a marriage. There's two people in a marriage. And I'm sure that the difficulties that Marilyn had were not entirely her own fault, but she's blaming herself and taking on all the responsibility for those experiences. I'm the failure. I'm at fault because they didn't work out.
Personalizing, or we could say self-blame as a thought trap. So yes, she's blaming herself for those marriages, like you were saying. And then there's a lot of shoulds in here. Well, I shouldn't have failed marriage. People shouldn't have failed marriages, and I shouldn't have one. And I should be better. I should do better.
I should have been able to to do better. It's right. There's tons of shoulds. So there's one experience, and there's a lot of thought traps in there for Marilyn. And obviously that's a bigger example. And I think it just gives us some idea of how these can be so sneaky and show up so pervasively just in our day-to-day life.
When you're getting shut down and you're not able to move forward, you're getting paralyzed, you're getting stuck in the past, those are things coaches help with.
Yes.
And this is a great example of how there's so much stuff in there and it's kind of complicated. Mm-hmm. But bringing some of this into the light is going to help Marilyn make some good choices, find her courage mm-hmm. and her resolve.
And shift some of her patterns and create new patterns and new thoughts and perspectives around her life and who she is that are frankly not just a higher energy, but more truthful, more close to reality, more motivating, more powerful for her.
Think of your favorite thought trap from this list. Here's the traps we discussed. Personalizing. That's you attribute a disproportionate amount of the blame to yourself. Blaming. You focus on the other person as the source of your negative feelings. Unfair comparisons. That's interpreting events in terms of standards that are unrealistic. Regret orientation. You focus on the idea that you could have done better in the past rather than on what you can do now. Oh, and here's a good one. What if? You keep asking the what if questions. Another thought trap we covered was emotional reasoning and also inability to disconfirm. So that's rejecting any evidence that might contradict your negative thoughts. Another trap, judgment focus. Ooh, that's a huge one. So what is your favorite thought trap in this list? Why don't you send us an email at thecatholicmidlife@gmail.com. Just send it now from your device, from your computer, thecatholicmidlife@gmail.com. Tell us your favorite thought trap that you've identified yourself lately. Thanks for being here with us. The Catholic Midlife Podcast is for anyone that wants to receive the abundance of life that God has for each one of us. Take a moment right now to tell a friend about us.